Hello and welcome to Tech for Non-Techies, the only podcast that demystifies the fast-growing technology sector. I'm your host, Sophia Matveeva, Chicago-based MBA and tech entrepreneur. My aim here is to give you the skills, knowledge and confidence to find opportunities in the tech sector, whether that's through founding a company, getting a dream job, or bringing a fresh perspective to your work. Hello. For this episode, I spoke to Alexandra Charter-Zubko. Alexandra is a serial entrepreneur and is also on the board of a NASDAQ company. Triptease, a company she co-founded, is a software as a service company that has gone on to raise $28 million and has offices from London to New York to Singapore. So she is definitely a successful, non-technical founder of tech businesses. However, she did not start her career in technology. Actually, she started it in banking. She began her career at Goldman Sachs and then worked at a few well-known corporates, including McKinsey and NBC Universal. Like me, she went on to do an MBA, and she got hers at Stanford. She then made the transition to entrepreneurship in the travel tech space. She has never worked with a technical co-founder, and she does not believe that learning to code is the best use of a non-technical founder's time, which is something I really agree with her on. I've learned so much from Alexandra, and if you are a non-technical founder or you're an investor who wants to invest in tech businesses and you don't have a technical background, then definitely listen to this episode. You will learn so much from her. Without further ado, here is Alexandra.
Yeah, so I finally took the dive into becoming an entrepreneur in sort of my mid-30s, actually. And I thought it was a bit unusual to be so old because all the famous stories you hear of people who are, 19 years old, super bright and motivated and drop out of university and found companies. Actually, if you look at the data, the average age of a starting entrepreneur is something like 40. So I probably wasn't in bad company, but that's certainly not what the media had made me think. But I began, in some ways, the seeds of my entrepreneurial career were born, while I was actually in university, although I never really had the courage to listen or pay attention to them. I was in university in the mid to late 90s, and I taught myself how to code just as people were starting to get emails. And I was there was no reason for me to do it. I did it as sort of a hobby and out of interest and to challenge myself. But I decided, and there wasn't, at the time, there weren't many entrepreneurial or tech jobs that I knew about in New York City. Now, obviously, looking back on it, I thought, where was my head when all of these tech companies were coming out? But alas, I chose a more conservative path and worked for the following few years in some combination of banking and consulting. But that didn't stop me from continuing to flirt with the idea of entrepreneurship. I started 2 companies and I consulted to one about 10 or so years later. But again, I continued down a conservative path. I worked for a big company. I did some consulting for a big brand. But then 2 things really happened that made me finally take the plunge. One was that I was working as a consultant to a private equity portfolio company in Grimsby in northern, I think that counts as northern England. I'm never sure if it's the Midlands
I
or.
think so. But I'm not a specialist.
Okay. So it's Grimsby. And so I was working in the frozen fish industry in Grimsby for 4 months. And I just thought to myself, what in the world am I doing with my life? This is nowhere in my goals as a child or even as a uni grad did I say I want to work in the frozen fish industry. So that was one thing that happened. I thought, well, I should really find out what I'm passionate about and do that. And then the second thing is I finally, I moved into the travel industry, which is what I was passionate about. I was working for a big company and I was starting to think about my next role, and all of the roles I looked at just looked like more of the same. I knew I could do them, but I didn't see the challenge. So I basically took the plunge. I was an SVP at a FTSE 100 company, and I decided to leave and be one of 3 founders at a startup, and I did that full time. And I thought to myself, I know the chances of this being successful are very, very slim, but it's just what I need to do. I've been thinking about this for too long, and at worst case, I'll have learned a lot. And 7 or 8 years later, that startup is still running. So be careful what data you watch and listen for, and make sure you follow what you're passionate about, or at least I did, and it's worked out.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not just running. It has now raised, I believe, about £20 million, which I think is about $28 million, and has offices from New York to Singapore. And it's called Triptease for our listeners. But from what I understand, when we spoke before, is that the idea that's the winning idea now wasn't the original idea for Triptease, and you had a few pivots along the way. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, and we had 2 pivots, and one in particular was really frightening. But the first one first, we had started as a consumer-facing product. So basically, our concept was a Condé Nast online, beautiful images, disrupting TripAdvisor, where instead of text reviews, there were much more user-generated images. And we quickly found out that building a consumer business in travel is quite difficult. And at the same time, we had hotels calling us, because it was largely images of hotels and hotel reviews, saying, I love this content. How can I get more of it? And a little light bulb went off, and we said, well, I'm sure we could charge you and develop a product that would help you get more of this content. And so we were very popular with 5-star luxury boutique hotels in the initial period after this pivot from consumer to building a SaaS product for hotels. And we sold some product. We had a number of, well-known brands who were working with us for a long time who really loved what we were doing. But as we started to try to scale the business, we found that it just wasn't important enough to hotels to generate user-generated content. It was, yes, sure, on the priority list. And so on a priority list of 10, it might have been 7 or 8. But, as you know, and certainly one of my big lessons is, the best way, or the fastest or surest way to build a startup, a company for consumers or for businesses, is to solve their number one pain point. No one really ever gets to number 7 on their to-do list. And so that was our insight about why, it was growing, but it just wasn't growing as quickly as we thought or as we wanted. So we managed, though, on the back of that product to raise some seed funding. We raised £1 million. And as you know, and most people probably listening will know, VCs tend to invest less in the product because they have more stomach and experience with pivots, and more in the team and the idea and the conviction that team can build and will build a successful business. And so we raised £1 million, and then our first board meeting, we said, that product that we told you about during the sales pitch, well, that actually we're not going to do that. We have this other idea that we want to do. And it was really frightening because we were all going through this sort of VC tech process of building a company for the first time. We had no idea what the response would be from our first investors who've given us $1 million, what it would be. But and nor had we, with this pivot, nor had we sold any of the new product. We hadn't even built it, to be honest. We were just starting to talk to people about it, and it was really just an idea. But so that was the second pivot, and that remains and became, the foundation for the remaining or next chapter of Triptease, and continues to be really successful for the company.
It's so interesting that you're talking about how nervous you were, because I've had a pivot at NT, the retail tech company I started, and I remember when I was announcing it, it was just the worst thing. It was the most, I was more nervous about that meeting than about pretty much anything. And I found that my investors who had experience in investing in tech companies, they just took it in their stride as if it's just a normal kind of update. They were like, are you still going? Do we still have a chance? And then that was it. So I was far more nervous about it than anybody else.
Right.
But you mentioned that you had two co-founders, so you're one of three.
Correct.
And we've often had on Tech for Non-Techies questions about whether you need to have a technical co-founder. And Triptease is essentially a software as a service company for hoteliers. And so because it's a tech company, does that mean you had to have a CTO co-founder right at the beginning or not?
Definitely not. I don't think you need a technical co-founder. I do think that you need to surround yourself with people, advisors, experts, whatever title you want to give them, who will give you an honest perspective on what way forward. So, I've found in reaching out to people I've worked with in the past, and either they or somebody that they know has performed that role for us or for me. So you don't need it in a co-founder title, but you need it in your life for sure. And I think if you don't have a technical co-founder, I think you need to sort of create a web of experts around you, because you don't always, and I say web rather than just one person, because you don't always know where your technical roadmap will lead. And so you want to be prepared and flexible for any eventuality. I think that sometimes if you stumble upon the right, and I think we'll talk about it shortly, I know you guys have talked about it before, but outsourced development firms, if you stumble upon the right one, then I think they can be that role for you as well. I think you have to be a bit careful, obviously, because they have a vested interest in selling you more time or people. But they can perform that role also. So I have not had a technical co-founder in the past. And probably actually the startup I'm doing now is the closest to having a technical co-founder, but even then it's not quite that role.
I just find that so useful and so good to hear, because I've seen so many people waste a lot of time chasing a technical co-founder and trying to get an engineer to leave Google, where they're getting paid a lot of money, instead of actually working on getting a product built with some advisors or outsourced developers, because I find that once something comes to life, then people want to join you. But when you're chasing people and you don't have anything yet, then nobody wants to join you. So, but I'm an only child, so I've always been like, okay, I'm just going to do something and then something will happen.
Yeah.
So, since you mentioned outsourced developers, you've worked with outsourced developers, and I remember you recommended the firm you worked with, and they're based in Poland. Is that right?
Yes, they're called Goody Labs. And Pavel is the CEO. I should let him know that I'm mentioning this name. Hopefully he gets a flurry of inbounds. I've made this huge mistake before. First time I really started out, which was that I had an idea for what would solve my biggest pain point, and I kept it all in my head. Mistake number one. I didn't interview and do a load of research of consumers to try and validate that this was indeed a big pain point, not just for me, but for others as well. And I didn't, and I sort of had this idea in my head. I wanted to get it out. And I thought, if I'll just build it, they will come, and the VCs will then understand the vision, and I'll be off to the races. And so I hired not Goody Labs, but a different agency early on, and I think through this experience now, I've worked with 3 different types of outsourced developers. I have a good sense for what I'm looking for and what not to do, but certainly a big mistake I made on my part was to jump straight to hiring developers. What I really should have done would have been to spend more time on the product and the idea and getting it out there. I mean, everybody always has a big fear that if I share my idea, somebody will take it and steal it, and then I'll be out of a business, which is just dead wrong, because 99% of starting a company is execution, 1% is the idea. And so I think that too often, especially, and I think young entrepreneurs or early entrepreneurs make the mistake of not sharing the idea and soliciting feedback and doing research, and they just go straight to building. And by the way, that A is expensive, B takes a lot of time, and C can often be wrong or can be stronger by sharing that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely found that non-technical founders, I think because we're so afraid of the whole developer and technology process, that we think, well, if I just tackle this thing that I think is the hardest, if I tackle that first, then everything will be easier. But actually, finding somebody to build the thing is not as difficult as building the right thing.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think you can find, you talked about trying to find that Google developer. I'll challenge whether that Google developer is really the right person for a startup. But that's a separate topic. But I think you'll have better luck finding amazing developers or getting a shop excited about working on it if you can speak with so much depth and insight and just the degree of thorough understanding of the problem you're trying to solve and the vision for the solution, which comes with that user research and getting the idea out there and getting challenges and making the idea stronger.
So what do you think non-technical founders need to know about technology? Because you did mention that you learned some coding, but I don't know how much you managed to remember by the time you actually started building your venture. So do we need to learn to code? Do we need to learn UX? Or are there anything else that you think essentially people like us should learn about?
Yeah, I definitely don't think the coding that I taught myself, 25 years ago was very useful for anything I've ever done. It was really just more of a kind of a geeky interest of mine. So I don't know how to code. I can maybe a little bit understand a little bit of CSS, but I don't know how to code. I am, when I first tried to figure out what does a CEO or a founder need to know about coding, I went to where I think a lot of people begin, which is Google. And I said, what does a founder need to know about technology? And the answer was the tech stack. And then I went back to them and I said, or to Google, and I said, what is a tech stack? So I'm definitely not a poster child of having done a lot of research. And I think that it's also really, as a non-technical founder, unless being a developer is what you're passionate about, you are just never going to be able to spend enough time and understand it to the degree of detail that would really be useful. So I think instead, taking some general classes like on a General Assembly or elsewhere that can give you a basic understanding of what is technical architecture and how does that differ from an actual coding language. I think some big broad frameworks might be useful, but I think more important than that is having a frame of mind that means that you're willing to be vulnerable, because being a non-technical founder means saying I don't know a lot and is asking for help a lot. And if you can't do that, which by the way, I could not do 25 years ago or 20 years ago. And it's been a lifelong journey to be more comfortable with saying, I don't know, and being vulnerable. But I think that being able to do that, I think will open up so much more possibility through conversations, experts, acquiring new knowledge than any kind of coding class could ever do. So I would definitely say, put those engineering books aside and make sure that you've got the strength and the character to be vulnerable. And I think that's the most important thing.
That is really good advice. I wish I had spoken to you when I was starting my first venture about 4 years ago, because I certainly did not have any of those skills. And so I would hear words that I didn't understand, and then I would nod, and then I'd go home and I would Google them furiously.
Right.
Which, was a waste of time and energy.
If you have an idea for a tech venture, just like Alexandra did, but you don't yet have the technical knowledge to build it, then come along to Tech for Non-Techies and check out the course on what non-technical founders really need to know about tech. I created that course based on what I was learning when I was building NT, up from being an MBA classroom project to a company that now reaches thousands of people around the world. And it's also the result of all the advice that I've had from people like Alexandra and other successful non-technical founders. And don't worry, it's not going to teach you how to code. Like Alexandra, I don't think that's a good use of your time as a non-technical founder. You already have a lot to do. Your job is to learn how to work with people who code and to learn how to work with designers and product analysts and data scientists. It is not to do the actual coding yourself. So that's what the course teaches you. So come along to Tech for Non-Techies and check it out. And the link to that is also in the show notes. And last but not least, if you enjoyed this episode, which I really hope you did, then it would be really helpful if you could give us a rating and a review. And if you have any non-technical founder friends, then please share it with them. On that note, have a wonderful day, and I'll be speaking to you next week.